Welcome to another video on a chess variant which you can play on the server Lichess. Today I will talk about a particularly crazy variant which is called Horde chess. And in Horde chess, White has a horde, an army of pawns, which are distributed among the first 5 ranks. And here you can see that White has in total 36 pawns. In contrast, Black has the usual set of pieces, so the 16 pieces as in normal chess, 8 pawns and 8 other pieces. The goal of the game for White is to mate the Black king, whereas the goal of this game for Black is to capture all of White's pawns. So Black wins if Black captures all of White's pawns. So this is pretty different from normal chess, and it's hard to believe, but the game is somewhat balanced. So it's not entirely clear whether you would prefer to play with White or with Black. And I know people who prefer to play with White and others who prefer to play with Black. So today, again, I will show you 2 games, one in which White has won and one in which Black has won. The first game is played by myself against the Lichess user Break It Down. And let's just get started. And as we do this, I will talk a little bit about the strategy. So White opens the game with a move d5. So the pawns can advance 1 rank here. And what Black has to do, Black's goal here is to break the White pawn chain. So ideally what Black wants is to take the queen and to get it somewhere on the first rank, because then once you are there, you can collect all these pawns. You collect one after the other, and in the end you have all of them and you win the game. But of course that's not so easy. So White has a very good pawn chain, and the idea for White is to keep this pawn chain intact as long as possible. The move which I played in the game is the move a5, which already tries to undermine the pawn chain. So my opponent answered with a move e5, and now I played d6. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit better to play e6 in this position, actually, but I played d6. And the idea of d6 in general is so that if White now goes for something like e4, I could go something like knight d7. And in many cases, let's say after c6, knight b6, Black's idea is to start breaking this pawn chain. Let's say White makes another normal move. Start breaking this pawn chain by usually even first taking on a4, then taking on b4, and finally taking on a4. And then later on, maybe bringing the queen to a8, and then the rook could sacrifice an a2 and the queen would enter into the White camp and could start collecting the pawns. So that's just a very basic idea for Black here. My opponent didn't want to allow that after d6, so he played the strong move e6. And actually now my position is already not that great, because my freedom of piece movement, especially of these pieces here, is very limited. So I decided to break the other side, so I decided to play c6, and my opponent wanted to consolidate the center. So here I'm now threatening to take on d5. So let's say after some move like this, I'm threatening to take on d5, then on c5, and then on d5, freeing all my pieces. So it's very important that White prevents this, and the move e4 is exactly what is adequate for this, because now if I take on d5, you can just take back, and this pawn chain remains intact. I played h6, d4, and again, it's very hard for me here to break this pawn chain, in particular because this pawn restricts my options. I went now for the move g6, trying to liberate the bishop on f8, and he forced my king into the battlefield. And now again, he didn't want me to allow to start activating my rook, so he played another check and yet another check, and I went back to e8. So right here, this formation is on the one hand good because it restricts my rook. On the other hand, he can never really go g5, because after g5 I can take and then my rook is free. So this is a formation which has its ups and downs. Okay, he continued with the move f5. And yeah, I started to trying to undermine his center. Now I'm maybe threatening to take on d5, take on c5, and then take twice on d5. But yeah, he directly tried to clarify matters by taking on c6. And you can see he still has a pawn chain which is very much intact. So I actually still like this position for white. He exchanged a few more pawns and went with the move d5. Strong move again, keeping this pawn chain intact, all the pawns on the white squares at the moment, and later on he can carry on and bring additional ammunition in the form of these pawns with move d4 and so on. Yeah, so I took d7. Now my idea might be to again go either knight e5 and then try to disrupt the pawn chain somewhere here, but more probably the maneuver which I already said, which is very important in Horde, which is the maneuver knight b6 and then a takes b. Yeah, he cannot really defend against this maneuver, but he can bring additional pawns. So now you can see that the pawns on the second and first rank of white have the right to move 2 squares ahead. So he played d4, knight b6. Yeah, and now I play this maneuver by just taking on c4, creating square for my rook. In general, in the opening in Horde, it's usually good for black if you can exchange 2 pawns for 1 piece. Because this usually gives you space in addition, but it's also really dependent on the concrete position. So just as a general guideline. Yeah, now his idea was to capture my rook. He played b3. I think this idea is not very good because I could just take on b4 and now yeah, he captures my rook. But the problem is that I get my queen into the game. So I played queen to a5. Now after some move like d3, which happened in the game, what I can do, d2 is similar, what I can do is I can just take on a4. Now I sacrifice a rook for 2 pawns only, but I managed to get my queen into his position. So after taking, I just took back, and now his pawns here are very vulnerable, and I will be able to collect one side of the board. And usually in Horde, if you're able to collect one side, then you are mostly able to stop the other side with the black pieces. He played a2, delaying that. Now I have options to play queen a3 or queen b4, and then I will start entering on the first rank. So I played queen b4, and now white has to just launch the pawns. So now if white goes slowly, I just eat all the pawns, and then the game is over. So he's launching his pawns. I want to prevent e5 in this position because now I could take on d5 in this case twice and sacrifice again a piece for 2 pawns. And so he now goes really all out with the move g5. Now I start taking the pawns, and yeah, this position is already very advantageous, if not already clearly winning for black, because now the queen has entered and he has no immediate counterplay for that. So g4, and now I just started collecting the pawns. So one more and one more. Yeah, and now this formation is again immobile, so this pawn cannot really move because then h3 is hanging. So on the other hand, without moving these pawns, these 2 pawns are too little. So what he decided to do is to actually go for the move g4 and really sacrifice this entire set of pawns here. Yeah, now the Horde advances, but yeah, this is of course not really working, and there are not enough pawns for that. I just took another one, took another one, took another one, and I went back with the queen, and this is basically game over because I have stopped his pawn chain. So he played a few more moves, king d8, and after e6, I took another pawn on g4 and he resigned. Yeah, so the c pawn cannot really move because the knight always take on d5, and if he goes for something slow, let's say like a4 here, what I do is I will just take all the pawns. I will take this one, then I will take this one, and the move a6 I can counter even in many different ways. One easy way would be to just go like king c8 and sacrifice this bishop, and now I would continue collecting his pawns one after the other one, and I would win the game, yeah, because the pawns are immobile. So even if he goes c5 at some point, I can just take, bishop takes, and the bishop controls all these dark squares in a very nice way, and the pawns cannot advance, and I will use my queen and rook to collect all of his pawns. Well, this was the first Horde game which I wanted to share with you. I thought for a change it would be nice to show you a game which illustrates also the white trumps in Horde. And this is a game between two of the top Horde players, Stubenfisch and Prometheus 01. And yeah, as in the other game, Prometheus, Stubenfisch opened with the move d5. And now just played the move c6, directly restricting again Black's scope of the pieces. So if Black manages to exchange a few pawns very in the early going and getting his pieces out, then he's usually able to sacrifice pieces for 2 pawns and somehow take over. So it's important for White to consolidate the pawn chain on the one hand side, and on the other hand, not to allow too many trades of pawns, and also not trades of pieces versus 2 or 3 pawns. So okay, e6, and now yeah, White decided to take this pawn, so that's actually a pawn sacrifice by Black. But Black gets some interesting counterplay now. So you can already see that Black's pieces, compared to the way I played, Black's pieces are now a little bit more free in terms of development. But Black has also sacrificed one more pawn already. Okay. White plays f5, again cementing this pawn chain. And yeah, Black tries to again liberate the squares for his pieces by exchanging pawns, and now goes for a similar maneuver like the one that you saw in my game, with move a5, trying to bring the queen or the rook into on the first rank. Okay, takes. Now Black has liberated an additional piece, and White still sticks to the plan of consolidating the pawn chain. And White plays really remarkably slow here in some sense. Yeah? So White plays just move a4 and says, okay, you don't have any immediate threats. And quite often in Horde, if especially Black has no immediate threats or no immediate ideas, it's a good idea to just push the pawns forward. That's what we're going to see now. So White just pushes the pawns forward, and Black waits, because Black has nothing better than to wait. But on the other hand, Black has a solid position, and once one of these pawns moves, so if the b pawn moves, a5 is hanging, if the c pawn moves, c5 is hanging, and if the e pawn moves, Black will take and take on d5. If the f pawn moves, f pawn is hanging, and the g pawn you don't really want to move anyways, because then it makes the structure much worse, and Black gets more squares for the pieces. So Black just waits, and this is sometimes a good strategy in Horde. And White then has to be very quiet and has to improve all of his pawns first. So that's what we're going to see. 4, 3, and now White takes action. And yeah, as I said, Black's idea is to take this pawn on d5. Again, a sacrifice of a piece for 2 pawns, but in addition, Black here can activate the queen. Okay, so again, similar ideas as before. at some point black wants to sacrifice on a5 and then later maybe on a3. Probably here the idea is even very concretely to go knight c6 and knight a5 and then bishop a3 later on to enter via the a file. So white prevents this by playing d5. And yeah, after another few more moves where both sides wait a little bit and white just advances the pawns, white goes f6, forcing matters. Might not be the strongest move in the position. I think waiting a little bit longer would have been even stronger, but it definitely makes some sense. So yeah, this gives black the opportunity again to sacrifice a piece for 2 pawns. And now white plays a very strong move, again consolidating the pawn chain. So white hinders black of taking on d5 and sacrificing again a piece for 2 pawns. Black goes into a defensive mode, and now again I think white plays some strengthening moves, which is good. e5, and black now has a concrete idea, and the concrete idea is knight c7, again with the idea of sacrificing the knight either on d5 or on e6. So white can only prevent one of these 2 sacrifices, and we get this position. Yeah, now white played b5, which I don't like so much because it's weakening the queen side. And yeah, losing the pawn on a5, because now after queen a7 there's a double attack and you cannot allow black to take on d4, because then black's king would enter on d1. So after c3, queen takes a5, d5. White has lost a good deal of the advantage white had before. And now you can see that the black queen will enter on g1. So at this point, when I looked at the game, I had the feeling that black is doing better and I would prefer to be black, but the white player now very skillfully navigated the way. So just went quietly with f5 and created counter opportunities. So just going g5, g6, g7, and this pawn chain is still quite good. So this pawn chain here, which means it takes several moves for black to actually break it. Black could take on h1, h2, g2, g3, h4, and this is very slow. So white has to be quick to organize the counterplay. Black takes g4 and g6. Yeah, now probably taking on h1 would have been best, but black took on e1, giving some more time to white. And yeah, here white played the move f4. And that's the point at which black went wrong. Black didn't have much time anymore, and now should probably have gone queen to h4, after which I think black is winning, because the main idea that white has is to push these pawns, and after, let's say, f5 check, king e5, g7, you can go queen takes f6, takes, queen takes, and now black should be winning because the queen is able to collect these pawns, and in the meanwhile the king can prevent these pawns from advancing, and later on the queen will take them all. So I think this was a good chance for black to actually win, but it's often very tricky at the end to avoid all these little tricks that white has if you're the black player, and so black fell for one here with the move queen takes g2, which loses on the spot because of the move f5 check, king takes, and now just g7 followed by f7, queen h3 and f7. Yeah, and black resigned. So in Horde, once white gets one queen on the board, the game is usually over, because then you cannot get mated. You have all these nasty checks against the enemy king, plus it's very difficult for black to prevent anything that white wants. So let's say I will give you just some sample line. queen is there. Now this is hanging as well. And let's say some position like this. And yeah, white can just advance, get another queen, get another queen, get another queen, and white wins the game. Well, this was the game of Horde. In Horde, as I said, it is important for white to keep the pawn chain intact. And it's black's goal to sacrifice pieces in the opening and later on to find an entrance for the queen to come to the first rank. And then in the endgame, it's often a case that if black is better, black still has to be careful because white has all these small tricks with possible promotions. And after a promotion, the game is usually winning for white. All right, thanks a lot for listening to the video. Leave a like and subscribe if you like the video. And I hope you try out the Chess Variant Horde on Lichess yourself, and maybe we'll play a game. Bye-bye.